everybody. It's great to see everyone on this beautiful fall day. Welcome to the Institute for the Humanities. I see we have a few people who are new to our space, so welcome. I'd like to tell you about a couple of events that we have coming up before turning to today's lecture. Next week on Monday, we have a whole series of events beginning on Monday at 10 a.m. Associated with the South Asia Reading Group. It's a whole day of events beginning at 10 a.m. And at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, there will be a digital humanities workshop featuring Kenton Ramsby from UT Arlington and featuring faculty from UIC discussing digital methods in their teaching. The English department from the Bilingual Forum the English department and the Bilingual Forum are hosting events here following that. And on November 1st, the Anthropocene Lab will be hosting an event at 5 p.m. And we team up with the Department of Germanic Studies for their Posthumanism conference on November 4th. That's an all-day event on November 4th. All of these events are right here, except for the Digital Humanities event, and some of them have also live streamed options, so you can find out about those by checking our website, opening our emails too, and following us on social media. I'm Mark Canuel, by the way, and I'm director of the Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Alexis Guilbault, who is our postdoctoral research associate in digital humanities this year. She was hired to oversee our multi-ethnic digital humanities project, generously funded by the Presidential Initiative to Extend the Impact of the Arts and the Humanities at the University of Illinois system. And her teaching interests are in Black history, Indigenous history in the US, and particularly in the Midwest. Her dissertation was on creating a common culture of slavery, Native, Black, and white unfreedom in the Ohio River Valley, 1700 to 1865. She's been speaking and publishing on her work in this area, and she recently published an article entitled Colonialism and the Expansion of Native Slavery, 1750 to 1800, in the journal Ohio Valley History. Before coming to UIC, Alexis received her PhD in history from Indiana University, and she's taught at Loyola University and Columbia College before joining us. She received multiple fellowships for her work at Indiana and also from external agencies, including the Filson Historical Society, the Society for Indiana Pioneers, the American Historical Association, among many others. Here at UIC, she's been teaching a course called Introduction to Multi-Ethnic Digital Humanities, that's going on right now in the English department, and she's been hosting workshops, collaborating with the University Library, which is our partner in the Digital Humanities Initiative. And she recently hosted an utterly brilliant conference on recovery and community, multi-ethnic digital humanities in 2022. Alexis embodies in many ways what we've been working on very hard at cultivating at UIC, something that distinguishes our version of digital humanities from many iterations of it elsewhere, which is not this perception of digital humanities as a bunch of people working in a computer lab in some other different place, but rather organically connected to the faculty and students right here in LAS, allowing them to work with innovative platforms and digital tools for the research that's most important to them. She's built on and expanded the reach of the digital humanities on campus, and we'll be seeing more of her work in the next semester. For now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Guilbault to present her work on business and bondage, Indigenous and colonial slavery, and the making of the Ohio Valley.
Well, first, thank you so much to Mark for such a generous introduction. And I'd like to start briefly with a land acknowledgement. The University of Illinois Chicago is located on the homelands of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Miamia, Peoria, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and many other native groups historically used this area for gathering, healing, and trade. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples lived here long before Chicago was a city and are still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous communities. I acknowledge I'm a guest on this land and offer my respect and gratitude to the over 75,000 tribal members living in the state of Illinois today. Thank you so much to Mark for the kind introduction. I've had a wonderful time here at UIC, and I'll speak to my research and my dissertation and briefly in the end what I've learned this year and what I think I can do with the digital humanities after 10 months of learning. So thank you so much to Mark, the director of the Institute, for inviting me to share my work and for his superb mentorship over the course of my postdoctoral fellowship so far. Thanks also to Katie Corbay, our new assistant director, and Institute graduate research assistant Alexis Soto for the wonderful flyer and setting me up nicely today. And thanks to all of the wonderful institutions that supported my work, and my mentors and friends and some family that are here today. And thank you all so much for coming. I look forward to our discussion. My talk is entitled Business and Bondage, Indigenous and Colonial Slavery in the Ohio Valley. Louis Joliet, a French explorer, and Jacques Marquette, French explorer and missionary, traveled down the Mississippi River from Green Bay, Wisconsin, to the Arkansas River, exploring and claiming the mid-continent for France. When they arrived on the Ohio River, primarily along the Mississippi, they encountered a cluster of Shawnee people just north of the riverbanks and noted that, quote, in one district, there were as many as 23 villages and 15 in another, quite near each other. They went further and arrived at Kaskaskia, which had around 1,200 people, and began forging relations with the Illinois Indians. Enslaved Black people made up a sizable percentage of these early French settlements, including French settlers in Kaskaskia, Vincennes, and other locales in southern Illinois, as people made the Midwest home. Almost every household in Kaskaskia had at least one or two enslaved laborers, whether they were Black or Native. Indeed, the enslaved population in the Illinois country included Indians from as far away as the Great Plains and the Arkansas Valley region in the South. Because their economic possibilities centered on agricultural exports, French settlers needed more enslaved people, or they thought they did. In 1720, the Company of St. Philip's, a subsidiary of the Company of the Indies, brought the first major shipment of 500 enslaved Black people to the Illinois country from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or present-day Haiti. These enslaved people, often hired out year to year or month to month, worked in mines, making lead and other products in what is now southern Illinois and Missouri, establishing France's foothold on the mining industry. As the French and Ohio Valley Indians negotiated and battled over their claims to the mid-continent, especially in areas such as Kaskaskia at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, slavery provided a mutual language for local alliances. Indians also gifted captains to one another quite frequently, and later to Europeans to make coalitions and partnerships. My talk today is drawn from my book project, Business and Bondage, White Slavery, Whiteness, and the Making of the Midwest. I analyzed multiracial slavery in the Ohio Valley region, which by the early 18th century was a dynamic, contested space comprised of native homelands and shifting Euro-American boundary lines. The Ohio Valley encompasses the land surrounding the Ohio River and its tributaries, including parts of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois. Its connections to the Allegheny River to the east, the Kanawha River to the southeast, and the Mississippi River to the west gave Native peoples and colonists access to the many diverse peoples of early America. Rather than merely linking the North and South, the Ohio River bridged east and west to set the stage for colonial development, as Native peoples incorporated and fought against French and British settlers in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The Ohio River existed as a transportation superhighway in the late 18th and 19th centuries, as the region teemed with officials, squatters, traders, soldiers, and speculators. Because of the intense entanglement of Europeans, Euro-Americans, and Native groups such as the Lenape, Miami, Wyandotte, Odawa, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Illinois, Shawnee, Haudenosaunee, and others, The Ohio Valley is an ideal place to study different systems of slavery and their intersection via cross-cultural exchange. And this is one of the best maps I could find briefly to show really the overlap of Native people that are living and moving all throughout this region, which I think is important to think about. So here in the Ohio Valley, from at least the 17th century onwards, Indigenous, Black, European, and Euro-American people and various forms of slavery coexisted. Bondspeople served as tools of wealth and power by providing physical and emotional labor. Because of the region's long history, I reject the framing of this region as part of the Free North. My broader work features Black, Native, and white bondspeople, including individuals often excluded from the category of slave, including white individuals adopted by families, Black indentured servants bound for life, and convict laborers. So I try to track both de jure by law and de facto, not officially sanctioned by law, or slavery that was permitted by a larger society. So there are varied forms of bondage in the region, and the persistent protection of unfreedom also existed consistently. I'm sorry about that. So my book will reveal the making of Midwestern white supremacy through these de jure and de facto forms of slavery, as well as the law and violence that set the foundation for later histories of slavery, including Ku Klux Klan terror in Indiana in the 19th century and across the region. So after setting up a bit how my work contributes to US history and slavery studies, my talk has two main parts. The first part of my lecture focuses on the arrival of French and British colonists and the intensification of warfare with Europeans. Colonialism enlarged North American slavery in multiple ways, including Euro-American and Native American people using Black, Native, and white bondspeople. Then in the second part of my talk, I will highlight formal and informal forms of bondage, de jure and de facto, and the legal protection of unfreedom in the Midwest. I argue that white colonists strategically employed unfreedom with laws. Oh yeah, this is right. So I was explaining, Dr. Barnes asked me to highlight de jure and de facto to bring these out throughout the talk for her students. So thank you very much for that. So as eager settlers in the 19th century took over more land and increased in number, enslaved Black people's contributions to agriculture, households, and industry also increased, continuing the legacy of Black bondage in the region. So thus, in the Ohio Valley, as throughout North America in this time period, slavery accelerated early capitalism, as well as white supremacy and prosperity. Today, US slavery studies is both an established and a growing field among historians, as well as scholars in other disciplines. The earliest works on slavery focused on slavery in the United States and on the US South before the Civil War, and almost exclusively on plantation slavery. Scholars have then turned to more fully recognizing enslaved people's humanity and their commodification in global markets. By the 2010s, many scholars research different facets of the enslaved experience, including daily life, family culture, social life, and tacit forms of resistance. Dinah Amy Berry implored scholars to consider the soul value, her term, of enslaved people and price for the pound of their flesh. Scholars of the domestic slave trade, including Gregory O'Malley and Walter Johnson, have carefully mapped and vividly described Southern slave markets and British slave networks across the US South and the Atlantic world. The history of Native American slavery has also grown, and it's remained a critical conversation in every history conference that I've been to since 2012. James Brooks, Christina Snyder, Stacy Smith, and most recently Andres Resendes, writing on the West and the Other Slavery, concentrate on violence, kinship, and economic gain as motivators for Indigenous slavery and raiding throughout the US South and West. They trace gender and racial ideologies in Native nations, but present balanced narratives that acknowledge the influence of colonization on these peoples, but also the dynamism of Native peoples and their resistance. However, like Black slavery scholars, this group also largely focuses on the region south of the Ohio River. Paul Finkelman, Emily Thornborough, and Maren Lucas's detailed work from 1940 to 1990 on Black slavery in Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana, as well as many works on freedom seekers, the Civil War, and anti-slavery efforts, provide an essential and detailed foundation to my work on unfreedom in the Midwest. However, while scholars have widened their gaze, historians of Native American and Atlantic slavery have skipped some regions in the U.S. scholarship. In Slavery's Borderland and the River Run Backwards, Matthew Salafia and Christopher Phillips describe the common goals of early American Westerners, like I described this transportation superhighway to the west. However, all these books also focus on slavery south of the Ohio River. In U.S. history, the Ohio River is long remembered as a dividing line between slavery and freedom, especially around the time of the Civil War. However, for area residents, the perceived divide was more rhetorical than actual, and many Ohio Valley inhabitants cooperated in business and bondage through the Civil War. A recent wave of scholarship, really exciting scholarship on Black and Native slavery in the Midwest, pioneered by Taya Miles, Brett Rushforth, and M. Scott Hierman, focuses on the Northern Midwest and examines the evolution and intersection of Native and African American slavery, connecting the Great Lakes, Canada, and the Caribbean to the Indigenous and Black slavery throughout these spaces. However, while these authors connect Indian, Black, enslaved people through white enslavers, I explore the roots of these practices and Native people as enslavers themselves. And this all comes from reading in global slavery historiography. So my work relies on the work of global slavery scholars like Fernando Santos Granero, Ehud Toledano, and Tatiana Sejas, who study South America, the Ottoman Empire, colonial Mexico, Southeast Asia, and more. Rather than examining all of the differences in various kinds of slaves separately, so indentured servants, kin-like household slaves, field workers, debt bonds people owed money that stay enslaved, this group, global slavery scholars, sees slavery as a complicated variable status and unite disparate forms of bondage into one multifaceted body of work. Across the field, South Asian scholars like Indrani Chatterjee and Richard Eaton acknowledge that, quote, the only common denominator was a slave's condition of total dependency on some powerful person or institution, end quote. After reading in this field, I realized that American slavery as it is presently defined is limited in its scope of unfree labor. U.S. slavery scholars often, but less often, present slavery as a phenomenon of state-based societies, states like the United States or Spain. The previously mentioned valuable accounts of all of these books have really shaped my career on North American slavery. Most often focus on agricultural and household positions, rather than considering the wide range of roles that enslaved people filled, including as contract workers, mediums of power, factory hands, or especially kin. So these historians also often only consider individuals and children held in perpetual bondage. I try to be extremely specific about how I describe the conditions that bond people live within, including those that are held for days, months, years, and more. So by combining broader definitions of slavery and discarding an Atlantic-centered definition that centers chattel status, plantation labor, or a Black or white slave-free dichotomy, I argue that North American slavery can be understood as a complicated variable status. So now I will highlight some of the changes in slavery with the rise of colonialism and then get into some of the details of the 18th century Ohio Valley. So as they had for over 1,000 years in the 1700s, Native enslavers still employed prisoners in their diplomatic and economic exchanges, and they introduced them into their communities and kinship structures. With European invasion, Native and now white and Black captives entered into deeply entrenched systems of inequality. With the arrival of Europeans in the mid-continent, Native, British, and French enslavers used captives for more purposes. Yet indigenous paths of trade and war provided the foundation for slavery within and between European nations. As they established their claims, which are French, these are claims to land of the French and the British, and in between all throughout this time. As they established their claims to land and integrated themselves into Ohio Valley networks in the 18th century, the French and British opened additional markets for enslaved Black people, as well as white and Native prisoners. This included selling them for profit, exchanging them as gifts to support new alliances, and using them as laborers as well. Europeans introduced and expanded opportunities for Native peoples to use bondspeople for economic purposes, simply by using bondspeople themselves. So indeed, the French moved into the Illinois country and they began buying, selling, and hiring out both Black and Native people. European slavery particularly influenced Native people slaving practices by increasing their capture and use of Black people upon their arrival. Indigenous warfare, including smaller raids and formal battles, almost always included captive taking, and personal grudges and local needs motivated violence. Native warriors often sought justice for the murder of a kinsman or to demonstrate an individual's wealth to enhance their status or reputation. By 1000 CE, indigenous peoples in the Midwest had captured and sacrificed many non-local people that are known to be outsiders by archaeologists' examination of their diets as well as their teeth. Because of their important place in indigenous daily and spiritual life, warfare and bondspeople also seeped into Native rituals, iconography, material culture, and other forms of religious and cultural expression. So this is a pipe that was made in Southern Illinois between 1100 and 1200 and depicts a Native person that's binding a captive. And this is held at the Smithsonian. So indeed, before Europeans even came to America, Native people in the Ohio Valley had their own motivations for holding slaves and distinct slaving practices. Indigenous enslavers assigned their bondspeople the status of property, kin, or often something in between. When Native peoples performed religious, war, or burial rituals, they sacrificed captives. When they lost one of their own, they often killed one or more of their enemies to avenge the death of that relative or fulfill another ritual need. When they required additional laborers, they put prisoners to work. When they wanted to display their power and status, they flaunted their control over their property and ceremony, highlighting their slave subordination and sometimes demanding their service. When their populations dwindled or a loved one died, or a critical position needed to be filled in leadership, they adopted captives to fill their clans, families, and leadership roles. When tribes needed to gain resources to maintain alliances, they exchanged, gifted, and sold prisoners. So for the captives chosen to live, according to many French observers, quote, as soon as the warriors handed them over, their life or death depends on their new masters or the tribe to which they are presented. Their roles truly varied. Drawing on scholars of Native American and global slavery, I argue that even though Ohio Valley Indians considered some of their captives to be kin, Indigenous people who took captives with no intentions of ever returning them limited their bondspeople's abilities to live lives as full, free persons. Because Native notions of hierarchy did not initially take the form of heritable, class, or race-based exclusion, many US scholars, especially those that don't study Indigenous history, often overlook slavery and stratification or hierarchy and rank in Native contexts as well. In reality, the intricate schemes of class with particular roles, clans, and prestige levels informed a status distinction and many orders of American Indian society and daily life. And this also drastically affected the keeping of captives. So while Native slavery was not always generational like Black slavery, an important distinction to draw, from their perspectives, captives were still unwilling participants in the lives they were forced to create. And enslavers ignored the trauma they inflicted on enslaved people by stripping them of their identity, separating them from their families, and forcing them to live and work in a new society. And I talk a bit in my dissertation about kinship masking violence, but I'll leave that and move back to French slavery in Southern Illinois to tie the story together. So back to where we started, in Southern Illinois in Kaskaskia. The French and the British, of course, brought their own practices of slavery with them, and those practices evolved as they colonized the mid-continent. Unlike Native slavery in North America, French enslavers justified their actions by crafting and spreading racialized beliefs and prejudices against Black and Indigenous people, which helped render them particularly enslavable, again, de facto forms of enslavement by cultural action. As early French accounts reveal, the indigenous slave trade prior to their arrival was multi-directional and widespread. They would be able often to gather guides from other indigenous nations across the country to French to help lead them into the Ohio Valley. So the indigenous slave trade was multi-directional and robust across the eastern woodlands especially, and they grew in both size and diversity as the French moved into the Illinois country and began buying and selling, and on our main focus here, hiring enslaved people. So while plantation or chattel slavery dominates the U.S. Dominates the literature on U.S. slavery to date, enslaving Native people and slave hiring in general, or paying for the use of an enslaved person, has a long history in North America. Hiring ranged from leasing slaves who were attached to a piece of land to renting out individuals or groups of bondspeople from terms that ranged to half day to a year in the records that I saw. So enslavers and slave traders were able to incorporate non-slave owners, or people who would temporarily own a slave and consider themselves to be a non-slave owner, into the system of Ohio Valley bondage. So for example, I'm not there yet. So for example, in Southern Illinois in the early 1700s, the French leased enslaved Black people and Native people. Many French people made hiring agreements where they loaned out slaves for labor, crops, cash, or some combination of all of these things. They'd be personal agreements they would make with each other. So in Kaskaskia in Southern Illinois, the French hired enslaved laborers for a variety of tasks as house servants, field hands, mine and salt laborers, which salt was essential for keeping food throughout the winter. And they also hired skilled tradespeople like blacksmiths and bakers for temporary stints on their farms, on their homesteads. Slave hiring made bondspeople more accessible to Ohio Valley residents. However, because of the scarcity of bondspeople at the time, the French hired enslaved people at high prices in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So just to kind of lay out almost the simple ordering of one arrangement that happened in 1724. So Monsieur Laplume brought Nicholas Chassaint, Perico, an enslaved Black man, likely from some other exchange that they needed to square up, as he was a storekeeper. So Perico, an enslaved Black man who would work for him for 3 years. For Perico's work, which was cutting wood, tending fields, and attending to his enslaver's request, Chassaint received a third of the wood that Perico cut. So this is a common exchange. Wood was especially needed commodity as Southern Illinois was building up. So to say how much this cost, in Kaskaskia, Pierre Abachon received 186 livres, or about half of what an average laborer made in a year for a Native woman named Asipa in March 1741. Abachon was then able to hire out Asipa, his Native enslaved woman, along with her infant, to live and work with Dennis Veronneau for 6 years. That would be a 6-year agreement that would generate him income each year, and likely later for the daughter. So while records reveal that French enslavers owned both Indian and Black laborers, they most often hired out enslaved Black laborers, though there were a few examples of Native enslavers that were out. And I thought this was just an interesting picture. So all of the information that was on the French hiring archives is on one set of microfilm that is in this tiny box because they all burned from the early 1700s. This machine then broke and I had to take pictures with my cell phone of the machine, but it worked out in a courthouse in Southern Illinois. But it's my favorite research trip, so I just thought I would share where they came from. It was really fun. So by the kind of reset where we are, by the mid 18th century, English and French settlers increased their attacks on Native sovereignty throughout Eastern North America, while also expanding Native opportunities to use captives. The arrival of foreign colonists pushed Native people to adapt pre-contact practice of captive taking. So Native nations in this dynamic world of colonialism and trying to fight back for their land quite often, or to live their daily lives, they take opportunities to deepen economic and political connections and social connections with other Native groups, as well as people with resources, Europeans in the region. Bondspeople had always been valuable to Native peoples. However, European observers brought these practices more to light in their early accounts of the indigenous Midwest, which we start to see in the late 1700s or the 1670s. So as early as the 1670s, Wisconsin-based Mascoutins displayed Iowa slaves in council with the Miami French and Kickapoo, demonstrating indigenous knowledge of the value of captured people. Pierre Liette, the commander of the Illinois country and a captain of the French regular troops, also described existing marriage practices among the Miami and Illinois. He explained how a father might bring, quote, 5 or 6 kettles, 2 or 3 guns, a skin of stags, bucks, beavers, and some cloth, and sometimes a slave if he has one, quote. This was a list of items that they might bring to the father of a native woman in marriage. So showing the exchange of enslaved people that's immediately going on as the French are observing it in the region. So at trading and military posts like Fort Detroit, Fort Duquesne and Fort Washington in northern Indiana. So kind of this consolidation of posts near Detroit and in eastern Ohio. Native people ransomed enemy, Indian, and European captives and return captives after treaty councils. So they would both bring captives purposely to ransom for goods and money, but also return prisoners of war in an effort to create peace. Located at the south end of the Great Lakes, Detroit especially served as an important center of trade for native European and later Euro-American residents of the mid-continent throughout the 18th century. Frenchmen from New France and British settlers, traders, and mixed-race children, most often the children of Indian women and French men, and enslaved people mingled all around the city. It was an extremely diverse place. And if you're interested in a study of an urban center in the Midwest at this time, Taya Miles' Dawn of Detroit is a wonderful picture of this space. So this was an urban center that rose in the middle of indigenous homelands. Beyond Detroit, colonial posts of all sizes connected native people to local and global markets. For ransoms, European officials and residents paid people in currency, goods, people, or supposedly support. By the early 18th century, native people also received money, liquor, and guns for other goods and bonds people at colonial posts moving into southern Illinois. So this exchange moves throughout the region to be able to collect native and white bondspeople as long as they're the enemy of the French or the British. Sometimes Europeans sold white prisoners obtained from native people into servitude as well. So a white person would be sold into servitude after being turned in at one of these posts. So, for example, in the 1750s, Sir William Johnson, the British superintendent of Indian affairs, so a high position, purchased a young white woman from the Shawnee to be his servant. Additionally, in October 1755, a group of Delaware, Mingo, and Shawnee Indians captured Charles and Mary Stewart near Great Cove in south central Pennsylvania. They then gifted Charles and Marie to the Wyandot and sent at least one of her children to the Shawnee. So they split up their family. The Wyandot then sold Charles and Mary to 2 priests at Detroit. So after the Shawnee sold these slaves to the Wyandot, they are then sold at Detroit to work for 2 priests. Their ransomers, one a Jesuit priest who lived among the Wyandot, kept Charles and Mary until they had earned, quote, about 24 Pennsylvania moneys worth of European goods, quote. It took Charles and Mary about a year to pay back their ransom after they had been supposedly freed from captivity and ransomed at Detroit. By 1754, conflict inflamed the already tense dynamics between indigenous peoples and the growing number of colonists in North America, including 60,000 French colonists and 2 million British colonists. Across the continent, captives remained central to peace and war making. The 7 Years' War pitted British colonists against British allied Indians like the Haudenosaunee and Cherokee against French colonists and French allied Indians like the Delaware, Odawa, and Shawnee. When the war ended in 1763, the French formally transferred power to the British. And despite the British Proclamation of 1763, settlers continued pushing into the Ohio Valley. So I say transferred power in quotes because there's French and British and quite a mix of people living in this space at the time. It doesn't change the diversity of the region. So in response to settler colonialism and years of warfare, Native groups began to unite across tribal lines. Anthropologist and ethnographer Patrick Wolfe described settler colonialism as a, quote, cultural logic of elimination that insistently seeks the removal of indigenous humans from the land in question. And I think it's key that then to replace that native society with a new society. And this is what Native people are really starting to notice and come together with across the region. So after decades of colonists invading their homelands and settling and justifying the enslavement of Native peoples, people from many Native groups begin to come together. Not everyone in a certain group, but they start to collect. In 1763, the Odawa-Sheep-Pawnee Act created a confederation of Midwestern peoples that includes many of the groups that I've listed in my land acknowledgement and other times today, including the Shawnee, Potawatomi. So really across Native people across this entire region are gathering together to attempt to lessen Native concerns and to stop their attacks. In 1764, British Colonel Henry Bouquet met with many Ohio Valley indigenous peoples to end Pontiac's War, which is depicted, some of the attacks are depicted here, which was a series of pan-Indian attacks. So after this group got together on British forts across the upper Midwest. So they got together in the upper Midwest, and Bouquet demanded that prisoners included Black people, men and women, white captives be returned, including adopted captives specifically. It took him more than 12 days to convince many of the factions of Native people to arrive, but once they did, he was eventually able to secure 200 prisoners that were taken in recent conflicts. However, Bouquet did not secure every prisoner because Ohio Valley Indians never planned on returning all of the captives that they had, especially those that they had sold, gifted, or adopted into their own societies. So now I'd like to turn to Native enslavers and Black slavery in the Ohio Valley. After the 7 Years' War, the French, British, and Indian nations, like the Shawnee, Wyandot, and Cherokee from the South, continue to raid across the Ohio Valley. And they start taking an increasing amount of enslaved and freedom-seeking Black people. Indigenous peoples sold Black prisoners to French traders and settlers living on the Wabash River in central Indiana, and in many French towns surrounded by indigenous settlements in southern Illinois by the 1700s, early 1700s, in the time period we've been talking about today so far. But for example, in March 1765, a Frenchman named Claremont reported that 5 Indians left the Miami River in southwestern Indiana, planning, quote, to take 2 Negroes, reported then to be at work at Mr. Sterling's quarry, some miles from Detroit, quote. Indians also captured Black people in more indiscriminate conflict, though we can never know who they were targeting at the time. In the 1780s, Captain James Distill gathered 40 men to search for roving Wyandot raiding parties. Instead, the Wyandot found them, killed 1 woman, and captured Monk, an enslaved Black man who was owned by Captain James Distill. Native enslavers found other ways to profit from their enslaved people within European systems, including hiring out white captives. For example, in October 16, 1755, Delaware Indians attacked Marie Leroy's home in central Pennsylvania, killing her father and capturing Marie and her brother and a girl staying with them. They burned the Leroy home and continued to Barbara Leninger's home, killing her father, injuring her brother, and capturing Barbara and her sister. They traveled 2 miles, returning with 9 scalps, 14 horses, and 10 prisoners, including Barbara and Marie. Marie noted that, quote, "We 2 girls, as also 2 of the horses, fell to the share of an Indian named Galasco. We traveled with our new master for 2 days." End quote. While the word master does not itself verify enslavement, the use of her use of this word is suggestive, and their subsequent treatment provides insight into the many ways Indians used enslaved people. Barbara, Mary, and other captives held by Native enslavers in the Ohio Valley performed labor immediately after their capture. At Kittening, on the eastern side of the Ohio River, quote, "The Indians gave us enough to do," quote. "We had to tan leather, make shoes, moccasins, clear land, plant corn, cut down trees, build huts, and we walked and we cooked." In September 1756, the English attacked and the Delaware fled to Fort Duquesne for 2 months. And this is a rendering of the fort depicted here. There, quote, we worked for the French and our Indian master drew our wages, quote, similar to the hiring out of Black slaves, where European and Euro-American enslavers collected money, goods, or labor for their bondspeople's work. In the spring, Marie, Barbara, and the Delaware traveled to Kakashtung, an Indian town on Beaver Creek in Pennsylvania, where they stayed for a year and a half. There we again had to clear the Indians' plantations, they lamented, quote, to plant corn and to do hard work of every other kind. The girls described their experience as, quote, bearing the yoke of the heaviest slavery, quote, and after years of hard labor, they escaped with the help of a German woman. And then I just thought I'd put up a picture of this forward just to show like the interaction in space that Indigenous enslavers might have had, finding their opportunities to hire out people like Marie and Barbara. Soon after the American Revolution, the US government began to implement laws, institutions, and tactics that supported Black slaveholding and compelled land treaties from Native people to leave their ancestral homelands. By dispossessing Native peoples, the United States both expanded its land holdings and its population, which led the groundwork for expansion and other forms of unfreedom to grow in the nation's homes, nations, fields, and factories. On April 28, 1763, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Beverly Randolph, recently the governor of Virginia, to talk about Kickapoo Indians capturing, quote, 3 Negro men, quote, near the Eel River towns in present-day north central Indiana. Judge Harry Inez of Danville, Kentucky, reported that in April 1790, Indians took, quote, 2 Negroes from Vincennes to a Miami village. Inez contextualized this single example, explaining that from April to July 1790, Native people killed or captured over 1,000 people on the Ohio River and in Kentucky. And he estimated that they took over 1,500 men, women, and children, and $1.5 million in current money of goods in the late 1700s, or specifically between 1783 and 1790. And I'd like to note that some of these figures are likely inflated, as a military leader would want to seem that they are procuring as many copies as possible, but it's still a substantial number beyond the small number of examples we can often find of these stories in the archive. While Native groups returned captives taken in war, and they also sold their white and Black captives, they also sold prisoners to other Native people. Captives taken by the Cherokee, who lived and hunted south of the Ohio River, even made their way to the mid-continent via alliance and purchase. In 1794, the Cherokee captured Ann Trotter, a white woman in present-day Southwest Virginia. The group of the Cherokee then traveled with her to the upper Midwest, and they sold her to the Wyandot. And the Wyandot then sold her again at Detroit. So trips to Detroit were very frequent from the Ohio River on foot. Because of this range and evolution of Indigenous bondage practices, like Christina Snyder, I argued that, quote, captivity was not a static institution for Indians, but rather a practice that they adapted over time to meet their changing needs and circumstances, quote. Indeed, as American settlers began to fortify their position in the mid-continent in the late 18th century, Native people increasingly took Black captives and adopted European slavery practices to their advantage. With this foundation, in the decades to come, which I'll turn next, slavery was even more normalized in the region, and the early 19th century territorial and US governments were able to implement laws, institutions, and tactics that supported a broad world of slaveholding. So now I'd like to highlight how Midwestern settlers perpetuated Black bondage and white supremacy while intensifying slave hiring to complete home, physical, and industrial labor in the region. These practices ensured the growth and adaptation of slavery well into the 19th century. The Ordinance of 1787 created the region known as the Northwest Territory, which would include the present-day states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin. The ordinance 6th article prohibited, quote, slavery and involuntary servitude otherwise than in the punishment of crimes, end quote. And the ordinance also specified that they would respect the rights of other states in the region to own enslaved people. Despite the language of the ordinance, however, both slavery and servitude persisted across the Old Northwest. Law does not always dictate reality, and the weak implementation of the ordinance illustrates the limits of law in early America. Because the governor of the Northwest Territory, Arthur St. Clair, interpreted the ordinance as, quote, having no retrospective operation, so it couldn't apply to the time before it, anyone that was settled in the region could keep their enslaved people. So English and French settlers that remained after the 7 Years' War remained, quote, governed by their own customary laws relative to the descent and conveyance of property or enslaved people. With these loopholes and a broad legal interpretation in place, white enslavers brought Black people into supposedly free territory in all states in the Ohio Valley region. And they also passed longer standing Virginia laws that permitted physical and legal violence against Black people's freedoms in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. One 1805 law single-handedly undergirded bondage in the Indiana Territory, and there are similar laws in Illinois and Ohio, just to note. On August 26, 1805, William Henry Harrison pushed through the, quote, Indiana Territorial Act concerning the introduction of Negroes and mulattoes into the territory, end quote. This law allowed enslavers to bring Black people into the territory and deliver them to a county clerk. So enslavers would bring Black people into the territory and deliver them to the clerk, where the Black person would be, quote, offered the alternative of either signing an indenture or being sent to a slave state there to be sold, end quote. White owners had to enter into an agreement with the county to ensure that servants would be cared for and provided with food, water, and shelter, as well as washing. And they also had to leave a $500 bond for the said servant in case the servant became a county charge. So according to this 1805 law, an enslaver could, quote, get said slave indented for any term of year that he pleased. Enslavers forced Black people into terms ranging from 10 to 99 years, according to agreements that I saw, but most held servants for 20 to 40 years. The state also forced enslaved servants' children to serve the master or mistress of their parents until they were around 30 years old, and they might possibly have to fulfill their family members' contracts, which would take them beyond that 30 years. So often without knowing, Black people signed indentures or enslavers signed it for them. And that would ensure that they would remain in servitude for most of their lives if they were over 15 years of age. Servant holders, like I mentioned, could also add significant time to existing contracts to punish their Black bondspeople. And they could also sell those contracts. In 1814, Robert M. Evans emancipated John Bourne, an enslaved man that was held in Virginia. He then brought him to Gibson County in southwestern Indiana, and he indentured Bourne for 30 additional years. So Bourne was indentured for 30 additional years, and then 5 months later, he was sold again where his contract was extended. Bourne must have realized there was no guarantee that his new owner would honor his previous contract, and he might have been enslaved for much longer than he anticipated. While many enslavers forced extra time from their bondspeople, it's important to note that some bondspeople did fight their masters in court negotiations, and they also betrayed mobility laws in order to gain their freedom. The 1805 Indiana law and the range of formal and informal servant hiring agreements across the Midwest is only one example of the common culture of bondage in the Ohio Valley. To ensure they had labor, white settlers and government officials suppressed enslaved Black movement and free Black economic growth and settlement. For example, territorial and state legislatures in Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky passed laws that encouraged interstate cooperation to return Black freedom seekers. So the Midwest would frequently and regularly jail enslaved people until their enslaver would pick them up, and they would hire them out if they did not get picked up. So, so for example, they passed laws that encourage interstate cooperation, and they also tolerated free Black people being kidnapped and sold as slaves. All states in the Ohio Valley region also forbid free Black settlement or required proof of freedom and pricey bonds, which would be $7,000 to $11,000 in today's money for a Black person, even free to settle in the Midwest officially. So by the 19th century, this mentality led enslavers and white settlers alike to make lucrative trade connections across the region. They were able to sell products like hemp, salt, cornmeal in factories across the southern counties where enslavement existed. And this allowed for the rise of cities like Cincinnati, Louisville, and Pittsburgh. Merchants in many of these cities sold goods that were made by enslaved people to the South to large cotton plantations. So they doubly profited directly from slavery. So because of the cause and relationship effect here, recent historians have suggested that we cannot separate histories of industrial capitalism, which is going on and goes a bit after my talk, and unfree labor, and the way that the U.S. government worked to prevent Black and Native people from being free economic actors in this period. So, this is like to wrap up. So increased people, markets, and conflict led to the diversification of slavery in the Ohio Valley in the late 18th century. Slavery was ubiquitous, and both Native and European slavery practice influenced the evolution and growth of bondage in the region as settlers began to fortify their position in the mid-continent. While indigenous groups already had a variety of uses for their prisoners, Europeans introduced and expanded opportunities for Native people to use bondspeople for economic purposes, including selling them for profit, exchanging them as gifts, and using them as family members or laborers. All of these uses served to maintain Native ways of life and mount their defenses against colonialism. Alongside Native captivity practices, French enslavers owned and hired Black and Indian slaves, and they greatly benefited from their work. Slavery was always an economic exploit, but with European arrival, the motivations for its growth became increasingly capitalistic, and many historians have described slavery as the rocket fuel or engine to U.S. capitalism, industry, and agriculture. The deep roots of unfreedom that many white settlers planted in the 18th century enabled Midwestern officials to sanction the many laws, or the laws I kind of briefly alluded to that allowed for Black servitude and slavery across the free North and Kentucky in my book. Seeing themselves more as Westerners than as Northerners, they eschewed the growing rift over slavery and focused on the benefits of maintaining a culture of business and bondage. So to reiterate, the variety of slaveries, along with a variety of state and federal laws that codified slavery, exploded with European arrival. And this has precipitated a multi-century history of violence and discrimination against Black and Native people in the Midwest. So the afterlives of these systems, both day-to-day systems, de facto systems, and legal protections of unfree labor still exist across the United States today. And I want to leave some time for a Q&A, but as I am working in the digital humanities, one of the great connections that I made this weekend is with a grant that was given this year to Dr. Esteban Real Galvez, who is looking to document Indigenous enslaved people across the entire Western Hemisphere. And so I'm looking forward to connecting some of the enslavers and enslaved people in my space into this project. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But thank you so much for listening. Oh yeah, any questions? Questions or comments?
Thank you so much for just offer just so much to think about here. I love the thread that you have in this project. I'm so far outside this history, so you'll have to forgive me if I ask a question that's incredibly naive. What is it? How do you narrate the shift from the diversification in bondage that you're so interested in? And you know, there's this incredibly rich archive, and you do this wonderful job of exposing just the many types of bondage and the many types of households and what bondage could mean. How do you narrate the shift from that to non-diversification of bondage? Like, is industrial capitalism the story that is the guiding force in that narrative? And are you saying that that the racialized motivations for slavery are a product of that industrial capitalism?
It's a great question. And I think it speaks to a field that I feel like is growing really right now, that is connecting Native removal or expulsion in the Midwest and the South with this history of capitalism. So kind of overlaying these two together, that the United States is trying to rise and grow economically, gain land and gain power. And in order to do that, they need to displace Indigenous people to grow their economy and gain this power. And by displacing, but the need to displace Indigenous people also allows for the rise of Black slavery in this space, because to necessitate removal, Indigenous people are easily, more easily undefinable as enslavable in the space. So I think that you're absolutely right that capitalism is a part of this link, but the other link is the scholarship. Kyle Mays just wrote a book called Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, and it quite eloquently ties these two themes together. And I thought it was a really helpful 5 to 10 page read on how Native removal and expulsion links with capitalism, written by an Afro-Indigenous Midwesterner also. So it's a nifty read for students or anyone else in the room. Hi.
Hi, so I just wanted to say, like, I really love your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm a Black Studies major, so like you can talk about a lot of this in my classes. I was actually just in a class yesterday with my Black Studies professors, and we were talking about like the Travel Tears and how Native Americans actually took the slaves that they owned on the Travel Tears. So like, we're just like, oh, Native Americans own slaves too, and it's just like, wow, who didn't really own slaves? So I guess my question would be like, what do you think was like, or like, what would you argue or predict to be the motive or reasoning behind Native Americans that own slaves? Because a lot of people like to differentiate different types of slavery. Those who own slaves, like, it's obviously not the same as like white colonists who own slaves, or you know, like Latin, or like not really Latin, but like European countries and Latin America that own slaves. Like it was all the different type of slavery and ownership. So what would you say was like the Native American like motivation for owning slaves?
Yeah, so I kind of first want to speak to the example you bring up, which is more mid 18th century, or like heading into like 1860 to 1880 story of from the 5 tribes, or no, 5 civilized, not proper named tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw in the South, that a lot of these Native people are migrating or being forced, whether they're migrating themselves or being forced, with Black slaves. And so one reason why they're deploying this in the South before the move is it's a mode of power. It's a mode to try to interact with white society and also to profit. But in the move, the one really interesting facet of the kind of scholarship or the story of Afro Native people that moved to Indian territory is what role do enslaved or free Black people have in Native land? What land do they get to claim in that space? That's just almost an aside to the question, but I think one of the main reasons that they're owning enslaved people is power and profit. Can you remind, was there any part, I feel like I missed part of your question.
Oh, like part of it was commentary, and then like
I know. I just wanted to make sure. I was like, I feel like your question was like, what might be, I mean, just societal, there's a wide range of societal needs. It might be to replace a lost kinsman that died in conflict over time from the 17th century to the 18th century. It might be for specific profit. It might be for alliance. But if you are interested, the first thing you brought up was this Native enslavement of Black people that's moving to the West. I've been here all the while by Elena Roberts. She was a graduate student in my program, and she's Afro-Chickasaw, and her parents came to Indian territory as Black people and trying to, like, that's what they presented as themselves. And her book is riveting on her family history and what the complicated relationship of being Native and Black in Indian territory in that time. And I think it's a good read. Yeah.
Well, I think it's been fascinating, and Kristen has created, he's obviously learning a lot in his classes on slavery, and the little of slavery I know is more sort of plantation era
Mhm.
period. But what I'm fascinated here in your work is, you know, you're talking about native communities owning blacks in, right, 1623. Where do these blacks come from?
Yeah.
Not only that, but do you? Are there laws or some bodies of treaty, I mean, of customs about what you do with them, or how are they racialized, for example?
Mhm.
So I'm, you know, so I'm asking you the inverse of Christian question, you know, like, it seems as if you're a slave, if you're black and enslaved in by, you know, the Miami in 1673, you're no different. Your experience is really, am I right about that? Your experience is no different than being enslaved by, you know, a Frenchman.
I would say your experience might be no different, but it very, yeah, I would say I was amazed how many, like, so the small examples I gave in this talk are every example that I could find of like a specific Indigenous person with a specific little story about how they had an enslaved black person or how they took them. I think the answer how they got there, one is through colonial interaction. I mean, obviously, and the question of the yeah. Spanish and French interaction moving forward, yeah, along the Mississippi. So it's just kind of the introduction and the seeping through of, I mean, not that this is being kind of simplistic, but from, you know, that French and British colonialism coming here, Spain, they just exist down here, is moving up. And so something that I was at a conference a few weeks ago that someone pointed out to me that I think speaks to your question is that there are laws in the late 17th century that are passed by the Spanish that forbid native servitude, because it's beginning more convenient for the empire to incorporate Indigenous people in different ways. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that key moment, especially around St. Louis, this kind of key center of that there's French colonialism coming from the Caribbean, French that are coming from the North, Spanish. It's a really nifty place, or to be, it's a really complicated space of colonial convergence. And I'm looking forward to linking to these earlier, the laws that controlled or at least spoke to what Indigenous slavery was, how it was supposed to evolve in that space.
Any evidence of racializing of black slaves? Anything that looks like that?
I would say not explicitly, other than they're using them for economic exchange, but I can't speak directly to that question, though across the South. My advisor, Christina Snyder, wrote Slavery in Indian Country. And that was like that was my entryway question into that question, was what did captivity look like in the North? And my question was, it existed. Answer was, it existed. They took native black and white people. And it's led me on this journey through to studying black slavery from there.
I'm sorry to keep asking. So what's now going on with native taking white people? Is there any social anxiety about that?
From who?
From the French?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's one of the greatest difficulties in working with these sources, almost to speak to like historical methods, is that sometimes captivity narratives would be extremely sensationalized or written directly for the purpose of cultivating fear. So in the French and British context, and especially once the United States takes over the region, and also with publishing and the increase of publishing, that's where I'll find a lot of the there's a glut of fear around these practices, but also there's a lot of texture and detail about native daily life that you're able to see from these narratives, descriptions of cooking, descriptions of work. So that was some great advice I got in going into research, especially about native people or colonial sources, is trust descriptions, not analysis. Like, don't trust the author's analysis of the situation, but trust how they, you can do some trust in how they describe it if you can find other examples that corroborate that. And that's how I like excitedly as a hard topic get to talk about Native people taking enslaved Black people across the region is this collection of small examples of descriptions I was able to pull together. Mhm.
When there was some discussion about Black people coming from the Spanish system of enslaving them, I finally remembered this book I recently read, which gave a lot of the I guess earlier and backstory part about Spanish enslavement of Black people that I don't think a lot of Americans know about. The title of the book is The Empire of Necessity,
Mhm.
and I can't remember the author.
Mhm. Yeah, but that's even that reminds me of an earlier book called Black Society in Spanish Florida, which just literally that's the argument of the book is there was Black society in Spanish Florida, that there is this world of Spanish colonialism down in
This goes
the
all the way into Spanish practices in places south of the United States. in
yeah,
South America.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, thank you very much.
It was for a history book discussion, but
Yeah, no, I'm kind of spinning in this earlier colonial period in this law, so I totally appreciate the suggestion. Yeah, Laura.
Thank you. This is an amazing talk. And you know, from the work of a historian, just showing how complicated it is and how layered it's over time. And like what I'm seeing is, from what you said, is like increased racialization from, 1805 or something. You can see it in the legislation.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to take, where I want to go, it's a little bit different. I'm not sure exactly the question that's going to emerge. But back in September, James Sweet, president of the AHA, wrote a column in Perspectives, the newsletter, where he kind of lamented the popular uses of history for current political uses, and how the legislators are getting all caught up in this. But then, we have this 19 project that's never to my house, right? And then he said, and historians aren't doing enough with, really delving into the past as a foreign culture.
Mhm.
Like a different kinds of logics, and we need to understand those logics. And then he said something about having been in Ghana over the summer and hearing the tour guides at the castle where the slaves were putting on the ships, and he said, the tour guide got something wrong, and they went to some of the states, they're going to all these other places. Anyway, the blowback he received from this was significant. And I think probably some of it justified, but I guess, I feel like you're pulling things apart in a way where we can see how layered this was, how it starts, how it shifts over time, which is really helpful. And I'm so curious how this might play out, not among the historians, which will identify your contributions, so we can see their slavery points of this.
Yeah.
But I'm just very curious about what you predict, what you think popular reception might be and how it could be understood. I don't think it will be negative, but is it possible in this political moment to introduce the kind of nuance that you're introducing and actually going to be part of?
Thanks, Laura.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess I'll speak to there. I think there is a negative reception to my work, which is like this idea that you can't lump all these different kinds of slavery into one category. It can be reductive to a particular category of Black slavery, which was terrible to say the least. I like to summarize that. So I do like to also kind of to speak to my experience sharing this work. I often get questions too about that if Indigenous perspectives were that they were adopting kin and taking in family, if this is the perception, that should also be honored. And to that, I also say, I think it should. I think that the perspective of the enslaver and the enslaved should be considered. But when you say, but how do we talk about this and still have nuance in the conversation, but with the consequence in mind of simplifying, or simplifying what slavery is, or provoking within this issue, I at least find this is my personal experience sharing this. This 1805 law is relatively bulletproof in conversation, to talk about how, and also that there are, again, Illinois and Ohio have similar laws. Ohio would say theirs is lesser than this, but Illinois has a very similar law that Black servitude could be slavery for most people's lives. So I guess the kind of answer to your question is, to me, sometimes going into the nuance and the particular examples often will allow people to be like, huh, this does all sound like a similar conversation, and I can grapple with this diversity of unfreedom that exists around space. And I'm jumping to teaching, or just like thinking about teaching this. One thing that I found useful is presenting this global history of slavery first, before diving into the US context. So in dealing with, even in public talks, or dealing, like you said, with this possibly difficult political environment, to speak about slavery and race in the free North, or a space that's considered particularly friendly, like, but being able to go into example, global slavery, that's what I was going to say. There's this article, it's called, I think, Many Middle Passages, and it talks about how there would be passages that enslaved people across deserts, across the continent of Africa, across seas in Europe, to go over to Indonesia on different markets across. And so to say that there are different kinds of enslavement and how people move makes it believable that in the United States, it could be this complicated world of Indigenous and Black unfreedom, and unfreedom at different levels and degrees. But I guess I haven't shared my work as much in public with the pandemic, but in a lot of conversations in smaller groups, I'm often surprised how well small examples and laws are very well received, or like people can't disagree with a law usually, or an example I can pull up. So
I guess one observation, just hearing you talk about it, is that in a sense, what you're doing is telling the story of racialized, of slavery becoming more racialized, and the laws that permitted that.
yeah.
So in a sense, you are taking us to where things were by 1865, or in some ways.
Yeah, and then I try to carry it forward, and yeah.
You show how the changes is legislated and built into the economy, and then the economy built from it. So it's very fun.
Thank you.
So you're not saying, oh, it didn't happen, or what bad at all. You're just saying, here's this complicated mess. The Midwest was implicated. The Midwest wants to say, oh, that's not us.
Yeah.
And oh yeah.
Yes, and I'd like to do my best to place these individual stories and places and clusters of enslavement in this arc of slavery, dispossession, colonialism, and how it leads us to now, or the questions that we ask now about unfree labor and race in the Midwest.
I'm not sure whether this is a question, maybe it's just more of a comment following on all of this, because I'm sort of deep into Frank Wilderson at the moment for other purposes, but the Afro-pessimist argument, it does alert us to a kind of ubiquity of white supremacy in our culture, and your presentation just makes me think about how important it is to see that that the history of the Afro-pessimism is just so deeply connected to the history of capitalism, and deeply connected to forms of servitude and bondage that have morphed over time. And so that prehistory just seems really, really fascinating. And I love the fact that while it's you're careful, I think it's great to be using the word bondage, because bondage has this incredibly capacious meaning for you, whereas if you talk about slavery for lots of people means something very, very, very specific, right? Do you find that?
Yes. And so that's why I center on dependence, or like
and unfreedom. Unfreedom can mean a lot of different things.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so I use them in my own work relatively interchangeably.
Yeah.
But I think that you are totally right that slavery evokes this particular idea of what slavery is. So in my dissertation, I grappled with like, what is this definition of broader slavery? And I did publish it in that Ohio Valley history article, because that was the first question a reviewer said is, where is your definition of slavery? And the cornerstone of that definition to me was a degree of dependence where the enslaver has power and extracts economic or political or social value. And that we have to go into more detail from that point forward, and that law does not always dictate what enslavement was, especially if you look from the enslaved perspective. And so, yeah, but no, the slavery definition question is another, like, how do we think, why is it useful to think in these big terms? And I thought it was interesting, like I said, there's been like a state of the field on Indigenous slavery at every conference I've gone to. And this year, everyone was talking about how we just should talk about slavery. It's all slavery. It was kind of like interesting to watch the conversation evolve around the group of scholars, especially the bottom three here: Christina Snyder, Andre Resendez, James Brooks, and others, Elena Roberts, the Afro-Chickasaw woman, talking about how like we have to just talk about it as this because it is, and then we should be more particular and could like and not like move our terms back. But it's powerful. It's powerful to bring these stories together.
Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for coming.